The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls the string. It makes his little puppets dance to every song he sings as the night rolls in.
Well, good morning, rural free America. This is the Connecting the Dots show with Dan Apple, and we've got a really great program today. We've got two guests coming on. The first guest that's going to be on our program is Mr. Larry Pratt, and I think most of our listeners probably are familiar with Larry, but Larry is, I guess the right term is Executive Director Emeritus of Gun Owners of America, and he took the reins of that organization in 1976, and since then he's been actively involved in the gun rights movement, and he's been very, very actively and keenly involved in all of the, let's say, the efforts to thwart the New World Order and their idea about taking away the right of Americans to keep and bear arms as they're guaranteed under the Second Amendment. Larry, I want to welcome you to the program, and I'd like to give you a minute to just tell our listeners a little bit about your background. I know you've got a very interesting background. You've been a legislator and other things. If you'd maybe tell our listeners a little bit about your background, and then we can get into the discussion for the morning.
Dan, I don't have Larry with us at this moment, sir.
Oh, he's not on yet.
Not yet.
Okay. All right. Let's hope that he gets on any second. What we're going to be doing is talking about the school shootings and some of the things that have been happening in this country. Right now, there appears to be a full court press on to try to get a lot of new gun regulations and laws in place, and I think we all understand that ultimately what they want to do to us is what they've done to Britain, Canada, and Australia, which is make firearms ownership so onerous and so difficult that we literally give up that Second Amendment right. And without that right, we're in real serious trouble. So, in any case, Larry will be on, and then following him, James Jaeger is going to be on. James is a movie producer, director, and screenwriter, and he has done a number of very good documentaries on the Second Amendment. I was fortunate enough to participate in one, an interview in one, and I've also participated as a producer on several of his movies. So James is going to join us in the second hour of the radio show, and we should have a really lively discussion about what is keeping the let's say the gun grabbers actively after everything that we have as far as our Second Amendment rights. So I will see if we can make sure that we get Larry on this call ASAP. Let me see if I can. I'm not sure. I sent him the call-in information, and he should have no problem getting on. Let's see if we can. Hopefully, I don't have any contact with him on email, so it looks like he should be coming on. Joe, if you will go to a short sound break right now, I will see if I can contact Larry and make sure that we get him on the call. Joe, are you on?
With Vitamer toothpaste and mouthwash. Vitamer toothpaste and mouthwash is a unique natural formula not found in any other oral care products. With a gentle combination of zinc, folic acid, myrrh, and clove oil, Vitamer effectively whitens teeth, removes plaque, and freshens breath, and it does it naturally without any harmful chemicals. Visit us online at Vitamer.com. That's VITAMYR.com. Or call us today to place your order at 1-888-558-8482. That's 1-888-558-8482. Keep your teeth and gums healthy with Vitamer toothpaste and mouthwash. Vitamer, nature's answer to healthy teeth and gums. And remember, it's all completely natural. Available at participating health food stores nationwide.
Thank you so much for listening to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Dan will be back shortly. In the meantime, Dan wanted me to speak to you about connecting your own dots when it comes to being prepared for any situation. As we have all observed in the news, natural disasters are occurring at a record pace across the United States and the world. Hurricanes and floods, earthquakes, and wildfires burning out of control. You could potentially have a bullseye on your own town or country. For that reason, Dan has partnered with Patriot Prepared to bring you a full line of products to provide the insurance that you need for any unexpected disaster. Whether it's our full line of high-quality, freeze-dried, storable food, our own industry-leading water filtration products, you can find it all by visiting patriotprepared.com/dots. It makes good sense to be prepared. That's patriotprepared.com/dots.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within would enslave us all again and deprive us of our rights in the Constitution. Restore the Republic. Wake up, it's time to understand. Restore the Republic.
Okay, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. I got on the other line, and we had a little bit of a technical problem, but I believe that Larry Pratt is now calling in, and he will be on our radio program this morning. Larry, are you on yet?
I'm with you now.
Okay, wonderful, good. I gave a brief introduction of you as the Executive Director Emeritus of the Gun Owners of America, but I want you to maybe give our listeners a little bit more of your background and the reason that you got involved with that particular group and why you feel that the Second Amendment is so incredibly important, and then we'll expand from there.
Well, good, Dan. Thanks. The Second Amendment is critical because it was the part of the Constitution, part of the Bill of Rights that was added very shortly after the final ratification of the Constitution that said, in my words, government, if you start going off the rails, remember, we have the guns. We're armed. You can't go pushing us around as if we're some poor country in Europe where we all came from. We're the boss. We're the sovereign. We're armed. And that's what the Second Amendment is all about. It's a statement of how you maintain a Republican, small r, Republican form of government that's limited, and it's limited by a Constitution. And when almost 40 years ago, the opportunity arose to head up Gun Owners of America, which had been founded by a California state senator, Bill Richardson, H.L. Richardson, I thought this would be a wonderful opportunity because it's the Second Amendment that really embodies the spirit of American constitutional government. And it has been used not only at the time of our founding, when we told the Brits that they'd gone too far, that they had become tyrannical, we weren't going to tolerate them anymore, and they could either get on the boat over there or we'd shoot them. And we did both, and they finally got the point, and they went home. And for a long time, we had a government that operated in the spirit of that Republican constitutional form of government where the government itself is an employee of we the people.
No, I think you're right, and I think a lot of our elected officials have forgotten that our system of government was designed to be from the bottom up, not the top down. And from the bottom up, it meant that the individual citizens were the sovereign, and local governments were more powerful than state governments. State governments were more powerful than the federal government, and the whole system was designed to be a participatory system where the citizens were involved and active in their own government, and that certainly is where the citizen militia part of our codification of the Constitution, where that comes in. We need to understand that we're all supposed to be there, and we're supposed to be part of that system. Am I right?
Oh, absolutely. And by the same token, it's not surprising that those in government, having some power, develop a taste for it and want more. And I think they came to realize, some just because they were going with the flow, but there were a few that understood that if they played their cards right, they could build this federal government into something that was really cool, and they could just, like an advisor to President Clinton had said, stroke of the pen, law of the land, kind of cool. And that kind of embodies the usurpacious view that so many Republicans and Democrats have come to hold about the federal government, that it's the boss over all other forms of levels of government, and certainly over individuals. Now, the Second Amendment, while it has been allowed, I think intentionally, by and large, to fall into disuse, and that was one of the great concerns of the founders, and it was one of the reasons, I think, behind the militia acts that were passed. Well, the first one in 1791, right after the ratification of the Bill of Rights, the militia was something that would, in a concrete way, enable the people to have a necessary part in the government of the country. And not only was the militia active at the time of our war for independence, the first battles were fought by the Brits against militia, primarily militia in and around Boston. But over the years, we saw the militia engaged in our politics in such a way that we should have, and I think to a certain extent we did, remember that, yeah, that's its purpose. Its purpose is there as a big stop sign to the federal government, that when they go down this road, there's no way they're going to be allowed to go any farther toward grabbing power in their hands. And so one of the episodes in our history, I think, that underscores how important the militia has been was in 1946 in the little city of Athens, Tennessee. Veterans who returned from World War II came back to find a government totally corrupt. And they literally, in an election in that year, had the police steal the ballot boxes. After the voting was over, the ballot boxes were, by state law, to remain in that place, wherever that place of voting had been, until the ballots were counted and certified, and everybody concerned had a chance to see what was going on and to attest to the accuracy of the count. Well, instead of that happening, the police just went into the various voting precincts and carted away the ballot boxes. And this is something that I can tell you my wife was kind of familiar with, because she grew up in Panama in Central America, and she saw her ballot that she had put in a box the one time she voted in Panama. She saw those boxes carried off by the military, exactly as what had happened in Athens, Tennessee. So when I heard that, it kind of reminded me that when we talk about banana republics, we grow bananas even in Tennessee, baby. So that was a robust use of the militia, because that night the area rode in their trucks and their cars bristling with rifles, surrounded the cop shop, and had a brief shootout before the cops realized this wasn't going to end well, because there were a lot more of them than there were of the cops. And so the ballot boxes were left in the police station. They were counted, and turned out the reform ticket had won. And I would remind us that we've seen one other major example of this just 4 years ago in Bunkerville, Nevada. The family of Clive and Bundy, Bureau of Land Management, because basically, from what I've been able to determine, the federal government, as a cat's paw for then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, wanted the Bundys' land. And the feds had pushed out the other 24 families in that area, very remote, distant area of Clark County, outside of Las Vegas. And Bundy was the last family standing. And when they were invaded by the BLM, they were told that they weren't allowed to water their cattle and graze their cattle on that arid land. And the Bundy said, "What are you talking about? We've been doing this since before Nevada was a territory, and we've got all kinds of contracts that recognize our right to do this," and they weren't going to budge. Well, there was an armed standoff that resulted because the feds wanted them out of there in the worst way. They actually penned up the Bundy cattle with barbed wire corrals, and they were preparing to slaughter those cattle and toss them into pits that they had dug for that very purpose. They were going to wipe this family out, because the extent of the slaughter would have been well over $1 million on the hoof, and it would have wiped that family out. Well, it turned out that those in the area, and then ultimately from around the country, were flooding into the Bundy Ranch in Bunkerville, Nevada, and the government realized that, yeah, they had the force. They could have wiped out those defenders and the Bundy family, but if they had done something like that, it almost certainly would have resulted in a civil war breaking out, and it would have been the federal government against the people. I can tell you how tense that was. I was prepared to go out at the invitation of the head of the Oath Keepers, which are retired and active cops and military. Stuart Rhodes had said, we want to have a news conference out here on a Monday. It was a date in August, as I recall, and we want to dramatize what's going on. We'll have the news conference right out there at the Bundy Ranch. So I bought a ticket at the last minute, and Saturday morning, get a call from Stuart, and he said, well, it's off. I said, what? I just bought a ticket. And he said, no, the feds just left this morning. They melted away. And apparently what had happened is, not apparently, what did happen is that men and women, unarmed, on horseback, rode up to the head of the BLM agents that were there and having invaded the Bundy Ranch. And it was a very tense moment because the BLM had their fingers on the triggers of machine guns. And a deputy from the sheriff's department rode over to the head of the BLM at that time and said, do you want to be known as the people that have mowed down unarmed men and women? That got to that guy's conscience. Happily, he still had some. And he lowered his rifle. The others lowered their rifles. And that was it. At 7:30 in the morning on a Saturday, it was all over just without a shot being fired because there was the will as well as the means to resist federal tyranny. The Second Amendment, in case anybody's wondering, is still alive and well and has been used as recently as a little over 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Larry, we've had some of the Bundy folks on our radio show, and we know that it turned out at the trial, and this is something that came out in the last trial in Las Vegas, that the BLM had sniper pits set up. They had cameras in place, and they were doing surveillance of the Bundys a month before any of this ever came up. So this was very definitely premeditated.
Very much so.
This is exactly why we need the Second Amendment. It is exactly why we need to protect that right, to protect ourselves.
You know, Dan, if this had been any other country in the world, there are other countries that have, to a certain extent, armed civilians. They have guns of one sort and another, probably don't have AR-15s and AK-47s in their closet, but they've got guns, they've got rifles, they've got pistols. But what they don't have, and unhappily even in Switzerland, which used to be the one, in my opinion, one exception for a long, long time, they don't have the militia tradition, the tradition that an armed people is ultimately the boss. The sovereign of any system of government is the one who has the physical means to enforce his decisions. And obviously, without firearms, the Bundy Ranch situation probably would never have risen to the level of local news. They would have been unable without guns, and they would have been unable without the determination that the feds were wrong, that there was a basic inherent right recognized by our Constitution for them to stand their ground. And we talk about passing stand your ground laws against invaders in our homes in the various state legislatures. Well, I think after the Bundy Ranch standoff, we probably need some stand your ground laws against the federal government.
Mm-hmm. I agree. One of the things that has come out since the Bundy trials is the fact that we now have a fully militarized federal government in various agencies like the BLM, like the Forest Service. These guys are packing military-style weapons. They've actually established SWAT teams and groups like that. And frankly, there's no reason, there's no justification for those agencies to have that sort of hardware unless they plan to use it.
Well, that tends to be the way things go. In my time watching this for going on 40 years, the good news is that while there are government agents who don't seem to have a soul and will just be following orders and do whatever they're told, the overwhelming percentage of cops and armed federal government agents and so forth tend to be people who really, more than other government employees, have a fealty for the Constitution. And I think that is one of the limiters that worked in our favor because, after all, it was the deputy sheriff who rode out, confronted the BLM agents, and the head of the BLM agents there at the scene actually had his conscience pricked. I don't think that would have happened in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia or... I think we do have, there is something different still about America, in spite of the many and long-time efforts by the left to suffocate what I would call American exceptionalism, but they haven't been able to succeed. There still is that understanding and loyalty to the notion that the government is an employee of the people, that the people are sovereign, and while we've had some terrible things happen, Waco, Ruby Ridge, nevertheless, there seems to be still a basic core of understanding of these concepts and of decency, even among unconstitutional agencies like the FBI and the BATF and the BLM with their SWAT teams and so forth. All that's unconstitutional. There's simply no authority for that. But apart from that, those people still seem to have some kind of an internal gyroscope that I think has kept us from going over the edge some time ago. Because when Barack Obama was president, I don't think what I'm saying about many of these federal agents would have applied to Barack Obama. From everything I can see, he was a committed communist. He was someone who was, in his own words, bent on the fundamental transformation of the country. Now, can you imagine if the country is basically sound? Consider an analogy. Some guy's proposing to his girlfriend that they get married, and, well, honey, I just want to tell you, I want to marry you so much because once we do, I can fundamentally transform you. Mm-hmm. You know, the next thing that happens would probably be slap. Mm-hmm. And
yeah,
that's what we got. That big, huge insult from the President of the United States that we had to endure for 8 years, and finally we're free of it. And I just hope that it's more than an interregnum, it's more than a pause, that we are hopefully headed fundamentally back toward a constitutional form of government.
I agree. I think that awakening that you're talking about is very candidly the reason that President Trump won the election, even though every attempt in the world had been put in place to rig the election in favor of Hillary Clinton. In spite of all that, Trump prevailed, and he prevailed because of his populist message, which was resonating with the people of this country because they were sick to death of the communists that had transformed America.
That, I think, is a good summary, and it was a concern on the part of the American people that was so profound that evidently in the post-mortem of the election, we learned that there had been a large number of people who had either hardly ever voted before or who had never voted before, and they had been pushed to the point that they were going to do something that they were not very fond of doing or habituated doing, and that is they went and voted. And it just completely befuddled the pollsters, and they didn't see it coming because they make certain assumptions. Polling is not science; it's guesswork. among this population of ours is representative that can answer the question that I'm putting to them. And if you don't put
Larry,
examples...
I hate to stop you, I hate to interrupt you, but we are moving into a commercial break. Keep that thought in mind, and we'll take up with that on the other side of the break.
Very good.
Wake up, it's time to understand. Restore the republic.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today I've got Larry Pratt on the line, and Larry's talking about the importance of the Second Amendment. Before we get into the further discussion, I want to remind our listeners that Debbie Boscalupi has got her Radioactive Wednesday program on tomorrow at the same time as this show, and she has a guest on, Dr. Harry Booyens. And Dr. Harry Booyens is a South African, and he will tell you just exactly how important the rights of self-defense are, because right now what's going on in South Africa is the disarming of the Boers, the farmers in South Africa, and they're having their land literally stolen from right from under them. So that happens. It's a reason that the Second Amendment is so important, and it's so important that we support our rights to self-defense, not hunting. It's our right to defend ourselves against tyranny. Larry, you were talking about that as we went into the break, and I'm sorry we had to break in on that conversation. But tell us why the militia concept has such an integral part of the American culture, and I think most Americans have failed to realize that they have an obligation to support the militia, because the militia is really, if we had it fully in place, we would have very, very few wars, we'd have very few really reasons to worry about our government or school shootings or anything else.
Well, the Militia Act of 1791, the first Militia Act, and subsequent federal legislation made it clear what they were talking about. The militia was defined in these federal laws as all men between the ages of, I think it was 17 and 45, and that if called, not only did they have to present themselves, whatever the muster might be, wherever it might be, whenever it might be, they had to present themselves with their own long gun. First it was a musket, and later became specified as a rifle. They brought their own military firearm with them, and that, I think, was extremely significant. And I was in Switzerland not long ago at a conference, and I learned that there, the one country that seemed to have a somewhat parallel view of the people as sovereign, the armed people as sovereign, probably at the time they were dallying with the idea of joining the European Union, something which they've subsequently turned away from, happily. But I think it was at about that time, less than a decade ago, really, from what I could gather, they continue the tradition of every man of military age being in the Swiss Army/militia, where at a minimum during his military years he has to serve 2 years, and if he's in any kind of a specialized service, certainly like a pilot or whatever, it's going to be rather more than just the 2 weeks. So he would come to the, say, a target practice in Switzerland, which they have fairly frequently, actually, but only at the point of the practice, of the drill, of the muster, would he be given bullets, ammunition for his gun. Otherwise, by law now in Switzerland, the Swiss keep their army rifles in their homes which is good, without the ammunition that can be used by that particular firearm. Now, they can have other firearms. It's not quite as loopy as most of the rest of Europe, but the one military battle rifle that they are required to have at home, they cannot have any ammunition for it, and will only get it issued to them when they present themselves at some point of muster. So it really kind of leaves America alone. In fact, that was the title of a book by Mark Stein, who you see on Fox News from time to time, and he sits in for some of the national talk show hosts when they're on vacation. He's really quite good, and he has commented on these things as well. He gets it. It's kind of interesting to hear an Aussie accent speaking Second Amendment ease. Mark Stein definitely understands limited government, and he's chosen to become a permanent resident of the United States, and I presume he's probably... but this guy came from abroad and understands how our government is supposed to work, perhaps better than many of our fellow Americans.
You know, Larry, that happens quite often. I don't know if you're familiar with Lord Christopher Monckton, that he's the same way, and so is Trevor Loudon, and a number of other people that are from other countries. They recognize our special freedoms here and have a respect for our system of government better than most of the Americans because they understand it better. It's kind of sad how few Americans really truly understand the rationale and the whole framework of our constitutional system of government.
Well, it certainly means that those of us who are just regular citizens have quite an obligation to put before each generation these basic fundamental concepts. And it's going to be a never-ending battle. The founders dealt with it themselves. They saw that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And if we let down our guard very much at all, we're going to see those liberties continue to slip away because we have had our guard down. And it was really, I think, the combination of the arrogance of Barack Obama, who assumed that the country could become communist, and he was the man, the transformation agent that would do it. And then there was this response from Americans that hadn't really paid much attention. Most people are busy doing productive things rather than looking at government, and they were getting poked in the eye by government overreach, and it got a lot of people kind of stirred up, and they were ready. And in a way, I guess we could say Barack Obama prepared many Americans for a guy like Donald Trump, who I don't even see him as a conservative. I see him as an anti-establishment sort of guy, but I don't see him motivated by a coherent conservative limited government philosophy, say somewhat equivalent to Friedrich von Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, where he warned Europe what was coming with the direction of their socialist governments. It's just that as a businessman, Donald Trump saw firsthand what it was like when a bunch of pointy heads who didn't really know enough to organize a two-car funeral presumed to be able to tell him how to run his complex business operations, and he just had a gut reaction, enough. And his anti-establishment views really are not all that partisan, and even shortly before he started to emerge as a victorious primary candidate, he had talked about, well, I'll run as an independent if they give me a raw deal within the Republican Party. And I remember that caused quite a bit of consternation. My only reaction to it was, I don't think it's wisdom to run as a third party, because many really good people have tried that many times over the years, and it never ends successfully. But he ultimately settled on being a Republican. Maybe it was just opportune, probably was. But in any case, you've got a guy that actually came to Washington with a bucket list of things that had made him mad and he was going to address. And unlike any other president, probably since Calvin Coolidge, and that would include Reagan, we've got a president who is on a mission. Not necessarily a full-blown philosophical, conservative, limited government mission, but he's here to do battle with the establishment. And I would say about 7 times out of 10, those of us who do look at ourselves as conservatives because we've come to these conclusions, having looked at history, having looked at what has been going on in our seats of government power, we're pretty pleased on balance with what we see happening with Donald Trump. And this is not to say that we're going to agree with everything that he's done. I certainly don't. But then just about as quickly as I might start to get a little chapped by one thing or another that he's done, I remind myself, but the choices were 2, Donald Trump or the gal that commuted without any pollution whatsoever because she was able to use a broomstick.
You got it. Well, Larry, I saw that you were a delegate in 1980 at the Republican convention that nominated Ronald Reagan, and I was a convention delegate at the convention in Cleveland that nominated President Reagan. And I can tell you, his effort was purely populist because he was stepping on the toes of the establishment of both parties. And the people that went to that convention, like myself, were people that were sick to death of the establishment, and we were looking for someone like President Trump to step forward and really make a difference for America and turn us back from the socialist/communist system that Barack Obama had tried to put in place.
Well, Barack Obama was, still is, I think, a self-conscious, hard left figure. This is a guy who had studied Saul Alinsky and his rules for radicals. Hillary Clinton was a contemporary of Saul Alinsky, knew him personally, and was a devotee of Saul Alinsky. And the spiritual tenor of Alinsky's thinking, which he described himself as small c communist. So in other words, he didn't belong to the American Communist Party necessarily, but he certainly had the same objectives. And in the inscription to Rules for Radicals, he wrote that he was dedicating the book to Lucifer, the first rebel, who had, through deception, gotten himself a kingdom. And that's pretty stunning for somebody to openly admit he's a follower of the devil. Obviously, somebody with that philosophy, when he gets into power, Barack Obama, God forbid Hillary Clinton, it's not going to end well. And I don't think a lot of our fellow Americans were prepared for just how evil that kind of thinking is and what they were in store for. And that probably is one of the reasons why Donald Trump was able to get elected, because there was a real revulsion among, obviously, a majority of the voters of the country who had figured they'd had enough with being fundamentally transformed. Thank you very much. I'll just go some other direction, but not yours. And this is, I still find it amazing that in a country that was founded by people who had thrown off the yoke of tyranny, who had objected to taxes that were a fraction of ours, who had objected to the invasion of privacy. Now, admittedly, the invasion of privacy then was a little bit more in your face and hard to avoid. It wasn't something subtle like the collection of metadata and NSA eavesdropping on every phone call in the country. They'd actually send a British troop or troops into your house, rape your wife, into your business, steal your goods, and that got Americans really hot and bothered, and it's why the Fourth Amendment, in some ways, I think, it may be underappreciated now in our times, because the Fourth Amendment that protects the privacy of our papers and our effects was in there because of the overreach of the British tyrants. They had experienced it personally, and it was injurious, it was embarrassing, it was humiliating, and that was all packaged by those troops. And finally, we had a chance to shoot at them when they shot at us at Lexington Green, and I admit historians still argue about who fired first, and I'm prepared to believe that maybe we did, because it was 8 guys, as I recall, and they didn't even form a proper line of battle, which was the way you were supposed to kill each other in those days. And it could well be that somebody, in all that excitement and confusion, fired his musket without being given the order by Captain Parker of the Lexington militia. But whatever the case, they actually shot at the British, and that was stunning, that the peasants would stand up to the king and his men. And then when they retreated from the Concord Bridge where they'd been repulsed, and they retreated back to Boston, which was a pretty good march when you're doing it on foot, behind every tree, behind every stone fence, behind every corner of a barn, there was those pesky patriots taking shots, and some of them were really good shots. And one of the things that so irritated the British was that they would shoot for the leaders of the British troops, the captains or whoever it might have been. And in those days, European armies were highly top-down, centralized. Not that armies still don't have a lot of you follow orders, I tell you what the orders are, but there's an awful lot of ability to adapt. When an American soldier loses his colonel or his sergeant, he's not flummoxed. He keeps on fighting. He knows exactly what he's supposed to be doing. And if he doesn't have somebody above him to tell him what to do, he's going to keep fighting as he's been trained until maybe another commander is able to arrive on the scene. And that's one of the secrets of American military success. And it was evident that day when the British probably lost about a quarter of their 800-man regiment or battalion or whatever the proper term, because they were suffering horribly on the way back to Boston. They just couldn't, not only were they getting killed, but they couldn't believe that these peasants would stand up to the most powerful army in the world. And I'd like to make sure that we make this point, that we hear today, well, what can you do with your little shotgun against the American military? Isn't that a fool's errand and bound to be defeated? Well, that was exactly the frame of the question back in the 1770s, culminating in the Battle of Lexington and Concord, because it was a bunch of peasants, a bunch of shopkeepers that took up arms against truly a very impressive army, a military force, and they were at the top of their game, and they were the rulers of the world for quite some time, and they continued even after we bid them adieu, and still we were able to bust their chops because we meant to be free. And I remember seeing a quote, an historian in the early 1800s interviewed a man who, a veteran of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and he asked him, in the context of what we're just talking about, what made you guys think that you should take up arms, that you could take up arms against this, still at the day that the question was being asked, the most powerful army in the world. And this peasant, maybe a shopkeeper, I don't know, but anyway, he said, well, they aimed to rule us, and we aimed that they shouldn't. And true Yankee scarcity of words, he just nailed it. And
that's a good way to put it.
Hopefully that spirit still exists, even after Barack Obama, even after the Federal Department of Education trying to bring us along the road of socialism. Hopefully that spirit is still there, and I'm willing to postulate that maybe it is, because that's what we saw in Bunkerville, Nevada. That's what we saw in Athens, Tennessee. America still has a pulse. Maybe the pulse is a little weaker because we've been so drugged, but we're still alive, and we can still, I think, come back because we're still alive.
I agree. Larry, one of the things, and we're going to be coming up to a break here very shortly, so if you hear the music start, we'll just break and then pick it up after the top of the hour. Are you going to be able to stay on with us for a while with James Jaeger on the other hour?
I would love to, but I've got so much going on, I'm going to have to beg off. But let me just quickly say that if anybody would like to be part of our Action Network, they can go to gunowners.org. They can sign up for free for our email bulletins, and that's how the gazillion people, over 1 million, get our email. They see what's going on in Washington, and then we'll provide almost always an email embedded in that message they get, so they can fire that off to their appropriate member of Congress. And that is what keeps these guys under control. I can't tell you how much worse it could be if it weren't for the tens and hundreds of thousands of Americans getting those emails and using them.
I agree. Well, Larry, very quickly, before we go to break, tell us how we need to be viewing these school shootings and what we can do to counteract the forces that want to disarm America.
I can't tell you how horrified I am when every time one of these things happens, and I'm aware that the one element discussed would, I think, put a serious crimp in these terrible events that happen, and that would be to get rid of gun-free zones.
Bingo.
98% of these attacks in schools and churches, malls, have occurred where they're posted no guns. That's where the dirt bags go, because they know that even if they're going to ultimately get killed or captured, they're going to have their maximum opportunity in a gun-free zone. And my mind boggles every time I hear somebody say, I can't believe you're saying that we ought to have guns in school. Well, we do have them right now, but it's on the dirtbags' terms. Why not make it so teachers, janitors, principals, people in the public who have a concealed carry permit, they should be able to be in those schools as well. And I think the first time one of these dirtbags tries the next round of mass murder in a gun-free zone, it gets lead poisoning and is no longer around to enjoy the media publicity that he gets following one of these horrible attacks. We are doing it to ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. And I think obviously the gun-free zone concept is exactly why these people, and your term dirtbag is just about as appropriate as you can get.
Well, it's the only polite term that I can use. There are other terms that we could use for them, but it's the polite one. And it is fairly descriptive. Although it might give dirt a bad name, because I use dirt in my garden, but it's not anyway, we'll just leave it at that.
Larry, it sounds like a commercial break is coming up. I thank you for being a guest on our show. I want to alert our listeners, too, that, Larry, you are going to be a speaker at the Red Pill Expo in Spokane that is coming up on June 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. And I know we're all very excited that you're going to be a speaker there.
Planning to, yes, sir.
All right. Well, thank you again for being our guest, and we'll pick up the other side of the hour with James Jaeger.
Thanks so much.
Working from behind the scenes, controlling everything from the daily news.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls string.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today we have a second guest on our show who happens to be a good personal friend, someone that I admire greatly because of all the effort that he's put into a number of really excellent documentary films over a period of many years. I've worked with James Jaeger at Matrix Productions. I've actually supported some of these films myself. And I really appreciate the kind of material that James has put together. He's worked with Larry Pratt, who I believe is going to be in his next film, one of the people in your next film. James, before I get you on the line, I want to mention to our listeners that they need to join us tomorrow with Debbie Boscalupi's Radioactive Wednesday. She has Dr. Harry Bouillons on as a guest on her show, and they're going to be talking about why it's so important to protect our rights to the Second Amendment because of what's going on right now in South Africa. And it's going to be an excellent program. So please join Debbie tomorrow. I want to remind our listeners, too, please support this radio network. And please support our radio shows by purchasing items from our sponsors and supporting this network. If we don't have your support, we can't stay on the air. So please do put your money where your mouth is, and let's support this effort to get the truth out to America. With that, James, I want to introduce you, and I want you to give our listeners a little bit of your background, and then we'll lean into your latest film project.
Hey, Dan. Great to be on the show. I have been in the movie business for, I guess, 30 years. I hate to think of how long because I don't want to give anything away, but I started out in Hollywood working on features, and was working out there for a number of years, and then moved back east and started making political documentaries. We produced Moulin Labe and Midnight Ride about two or 3 years ago in succession, and both of these movies are on the Second Amendment. They're both based on the works of Dr. Edwin Vieira, Sword and Sovereignty, and By Tyranny Out of Necessity. Unfortunately, the shootings and the atrocities that have been continuing prompted us to make the current movie, which we've entitled Good Guys with Guns, borrowing the phrase from NRA leader Wayne LaPierre. And so we're in production on this, and we're hoping that this movie will shed some light on some of the solutions to the problem, and we hope that those solutions will reflect constitutional solutions that the founders would have approved of.
Okay, good. James, I want to lean in first off with the reasoning, the rationale behind the Second Amendment. And you've done an awful lot of research and study on this, and I want to bring to our listeners, we had Larry Pratt on in the last hour, and we've had Dr. Edwin Vieira on last week, and he's actually going to be on again next week. We're going to be talking a little more in depth on a little different subject. Next week, we're going to be talking about the mainstream media and just exactly how deep the deep state is and why it exists. And so in any case, I want to give you an opportunity, James, to talk about why the Second Amendment is so incredibly important. We've been really focusing on the well-regulated militia and the Second Amendment for the last 2 weeks. And the reason we're doing that is because I think Americans need to understand that if we lose the right to keep and bear arms in this nation, we will lose our right to self-defense. And by self-defense, I'm saying not only in our homes against someone breaking in or something like that, but also against a tyrannical government that's completely out of control. And in the last hour, Larry talked about Bunkerville and what happened with the BLM, which has become militarized over the last 8 or 10 years. So let's talk about why it's so important to support the Second Amendment. James, tell our listeners just exactly what all your research, you've got some excellent points that you've brought out in several emails that I've received, and you had 5 points that really are what the Second Amendment is all about. Would you refer to those 5 points, and then we'll go on further to the school shootings?
Yes, I was trying to enumerate the reasons we keep and bear, and I came up with 5 basic reasons. And when I first put them out, I kind of put them out in the reverse order. I put them out, the order being the first reason being target practice, the second reason being hunting, the third being self-defense, the fourth being deterrent against tyranny, and the fifth being as your duty to serve in your state militia. And then it dawned on me that if everybody's talking about, well, the first reason to keep and bear is target practice, and the second is sport shooting and hunting and self-defense, if we put it in that order, we really have it backwards. Because really, the first reason we keep and bear is as a deterrent against tyranny and to serve in the militia, which the Second Amendment talks about, a well-regulated militia being necessary. So, in essence, what has happened is, I think the NRA and everybody in the Second Amendment advocates have been painted into a corner by the gun control lobby and the mainstream media by declaring that the reason we keep and bear is for target practice, hunting, and self-defense. It makes sense that we would not need to keep and bear weapons, so-called weapons of war, AK-47s and AR-12s and things like that. and that it looks pretty foolish to have these kinds of weapons for hunting target practice and even most of self-defense. So this is the rationale that they're using to slowly infringe the Second Amendment and remove gun rights. What we really need to be doing is talking about what's in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. And Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 says there's three purposes for keeping the militia: to enforce the laws of the Union, to suppress insurrections and repel invasions. Well, the question any citizen should ask is, what kind of a weapon do you need to suppress an invasion or repel an insurrection? Do you use handguns, pistols, shotguns, pop guns, BB guns, pellet guns? No, you need weapons of war that would be commensurate with any weapons that any invader or insurrectionist would be using to do this. In other words, to fulfill the first duty of repelling, serving as in the militia, or repelling repelling any kind of tyranny, you need to have a weapon of war. So therefore, we should place the very first reason for keeping and bearing is deterrence against tyranny and to serve in your state militia. And then it makes sense. Having larger weapons like this makes total sense. And the other 3 points are more subordinate. Because let's face it, if you have to go through the same thing we went through with Lexington and with King George, we don't want to go through that again. We never want to go through that again. So we want to have the citizen is armed in order to protect themselves from a tyrannical government. And it's unfortunate to have to say it, but every government that's ever existed on this planet has got the potential to become tyrannical. The people take over power. Lord Acton warned us, power corrupts, and ultimate power corrupts ultimately. So we have to constantly be vigilant. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and this is reflected in the Second Amendment, and the founders gave us the Second Amendment and the other 3 militia causes to maintain the security of a free state and to give us constant vigilance against any kind of rogue politicians or usurpers that could possibly take over the state. And that's really what the Second Amendment is for and what it's about.
Okay, James, and then I think it's important that our listeners understand, and this is something that Edwin was trying to relay last week, but that our listeners understand that there is a responsibility as a citizen of the United States to participate in the self-defense of our country. And if we do that, and if we are properly trained and we are a citizen militia, it really eliminates an awful lot of need for a large military complex that ultimately has the power to take away the citizens' rights. Tell our listeners a little bit about that philosophy, that way of thinking, because if we participate and we actually get out and work as parts of the militia and we get the training that we need, we don't need to have this huge military-industrial complex, which literally has taken over much of our country.
That's right. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about is alive and well. And the keynote is we have a nation of balances of power. We have a check and balance system. The state militia system versus the state militia system and the federal Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force are basically 2 different systems that should keep a check and balance on each other. This is the United States. It's not the United States as an entity. It's the states that are united. And the states have united under a federal government, which is charged with the responsibility of having an army and a navy and so on to protect us from external enemies and provide external security. But since we're a self-governing nation, it follows that we should also be self-protecting, which means we should have citizens in charge of their own security in each state. And that's known as the militia of the several states. This system has been allowed to atrophy over the past 150 years. The powers that be, the usurpers and tyrants in Washington that are trying to destroy the federal system with Title X have phased the militia system out. They've taken the militia system, I guess Edwin is much better at explaining this whole thing, but in essence, they took the militia system of the founders, which is compulsory and universal. In other words, everybody is supposed to participate in it, and that's the key point here, that everybody has a part in their own defense, I think is what you were trying to say. And they've taken the militia and they've bifurcated it into the organized and unorganized militia. In essence, they've taken the organized militia and converted it into the National Guard, placed that under the Army as an adjunct to the Army, and then they put everybody else in the country in the unorganized militia to really do nothing. And if we were to use the unorganized militia to solve some of our problems, such as these school shootings and various investigations into situations that have happened that the federal government does not seem to be properly investigating, I think we would be getting right back onto constitutional principles.
Well, and James, I think too that the demonization of the term militia, which has been a product of the mainstream media over the last 40 or 50 years, has made people have a total misunderstanding of what the militia concept is all about.
That's exactly right. The mainstream media is part of the gun control lobby, and we produced a 4-part miniseries last year called Mainstream. I invite anyone who is interested in finding out more about how the Hollywood and how the media works and how it operates to basically support the gun control lobby. They can watch this movie at homevideo.net, where the movie is up, or get it at moviepubs.net on DVD. And we go exhaustively into the media and how they support the gun control lobby and the globalist agenda. And that is a big part of the problem. I have some ideas of what we can do about the media, but we have to properly educate people. Most people, the public school system just does not teach sufficiently the subject of the militia. As you mentioned, the M word has been vilified, and people think that a militia is a bunch of guys running around in the woods with guns, when in fact when we talk about the militia system, we're talking about a constitutional militia. It is a government institution under the governors of each one of the respective states. They are well regulated. The people in the militia are trained, and that's what we need to get back to today. Good guys with guns really is a metaphor for the militia.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the concept of the militia, and I think our listeners need to understand this, concept of the militia has always been just self-defense against any tyranny, against any evil that comes up in society, and it does require that citizens are responsible for their own safety. Our police forces are not effective at preventing crime. They're only effective at maybe solving crime, and that's even questionable. But they're not out there to prevent crime because, quite frankly, they can't. How can you stop something from happening before it happens if you're not there? And there aren't enough police in the world to try to solve crimes before they happen. That just cannot happen. So it's imperative that people understand that our self-defense is something we are supposed to do for ourselves.
That's right. The statistics indicate 70% of the time the average incident, mass shooting, is over in 5 minutes, but the police usually don't get there for 11 minutes. So this right there shows that we're dealing with an almost impossible situation. You're just going to have trained good guys with guns placed in these schools and being around public spaces. This whole concept of a gun-free zone is totally insane and absolutely infringes the Second Amendment. And I would take it further and say that any legislators that pass laws that are gun-free zones or in any way infringe the Second Amendment should be action should be taken against them. They should literally be sued because they are violating the highest law in the land. And any judges that adjudicate in the favor of these gun-free zones or gun regulations are infringing the highest law in the land. They should be removed from the bench. Mm-hmm. And I think if we started doing some of this and enforcing the Constitution, and Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 says that the militia, its first duty is to enforce the laws of the land. And that includes enforcing the Constitution, because the Constitution is not only the law of the land, it is the highest law of the land. So this is all part of a self-governing nation. And when we start doing things like this, emulating the system advised by the founders, we're going to start seeing these shootings in these schools diminish.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think that the concept of a gun-free zone is about the stupidest thing that you could possibly do. And I know, James, you and I have talked about this. When we were kids, I used to take firearms to school, and I'd actually leave them in the office and then go out after school hunting and shooting. We had a rifle club, and we learned how to use firearms right in the school. In the basement of the gymnasium, we had a rifle range, and that was the way it was in times past. And frankly, if we were to go back to that, I think we'd have a whole lot less opportunity for the few nutcases that are out there to go in and shoot up a school.
Absolutely. When we were teenagers, there were firearms all over. We target practiced. We went deer hunting, pheasant hunting. Every father taught his son how to properly handle a gun and safely. There were none of these school shootings. It's not the people. It's the fact that we have this gun-free zone and we have these kids that are most of the cases they're on psychiatric drugs. My late father was a psychiatrist, and he practiced at the Norristown State Hospital. And when he was practicing in the 60s, I'll never forget the day he came up to me one day with a pill in his hand, and he held it up and he said, "Jimmy, this is going to change everything." And this pill was a pill called Thorazine, which was a new psychiatric drug which was invented in the 1950s. Well, by the 1960s, the patients at Norristown, and there were something like, I don't know the number, but it must have been in the thousands, they were released from Norristown and placed on this new drug, Thorazine. And my father was in charge of the violent male building. So he was in charge of the most violent, psychotic people in the state of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But these people were all let out of the mental institutions between the early 60s and the 70s on psychiatric drugs such as Thorazine. And if you look at the records, this is when the mass shootings started to happen in public places. These thousands of people being let out of these state institutions on psychiatric drugs because it was cheaper for the taxpayer to basically close up the hospital. So today, Norristown, I was over there last year, and there's maybe only about 50 people in Norristown State Mental Hospital. So we've, in essence, the taxpayer and Americans have got to take some responsibility for this. Because they didn't want to properly care for the mentally insane, they let them out on the streets. We've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of psychiatric cases running around this country taking psychiatric drugs. They're all on Big Pharma's product. The mainstream media is not talking about any of this. We cover all this in Mainstream, our movie, because the mainstream media profits from Big Pharma's product. Almost every other television commercial you see on ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, Fox News, and the other one is a Big Pharma drug product. So we not only have an opioid epidemic, we have these psychiatric drugs being distributed and used by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. This is a recipe for disaster when you have these kids and people on all these drugs. And then it's not the guns, it's the drugs.
Right,
so
exactly.
We have got to wake up about the psychiatric drugs should not be, people on psychiatric drugs should not be allowed to buy or own firearms.
No, I agree. But that is, it's like Big Pharma has created the scenario by creating these drugs, and at the same time, it perpetuates the system, because once these people are hooked on these drugs, then they are basically targets for more drugs and more experimentation. And at the same time, these drugs have side effects that people absolutely cannot anticipate. I mean, you know, one of the things you're talking about is you look at Big Pharma on TV or all these ads, they'll advertise a product, a pharmaceutical product, and then they talk for 3 minutes afterwards about all the side effects. And it's obvious that we are really under the control of Big Pharma in this country, and you're right, we need to eliminate the right to those people on those psychotropic drugs to be able to purchase guns, but we also need to start eliminating the use of pharmaceuticals to such an incredible extent in this country.
That's right. We have a tricky problem here, because as soon as you deem that criminals, psychos, and children should not own or buy firearms, so you're putting some kind of restriction on it. And I believe that these three classes of people, criminals, adjudicated psychiatric cases, and children, however you want to define children, that is being batted around right now. Once you define that, then you're into the situation, well, how do you administer these restrictions? Because that then ends up getting you into a dossier system or a registration system. And I don't know if Dr. Vieira talked about this, but we go over this exhaustively in the movie Molon Labe, which your listeners get.
James, I hate to interrupt, but we've got a commercial break coming up, but let's pick up that thought on the other side, and we'll talk about the school shootings and your solutions.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and I've got James Jaeger as my guest on this morning, and we are talking about the Second Amendment, and we're talking about several really important films that James has produced and directed, and a new project that he's got coming up called Good Guys with Guns. And before we get back into the discussion, I do want to remind our listeners, please support this station. please support our advertisers and buy their products. And please tune in tomorrow and listen to Debbie Boscalupi's Radioactive Wednesday program. She's going to have Dr. Harry Bouillons on, and they're going to be talking about South Africa and why the Second Amendment in the United States is really an important thing to continue to hold. So with that, James, I want to get back to your discussion. I'm sorry we had to cut you off, but you had sent me a solutions to the school shootings, and there were 15 items on that list, and I'd like to have you kind of talk about how you see these 15 items making a huge difference in the end of these school shootings.
Well, I've been compiling a list. These are not all my ideas. They're ideas that other people have come up with that I've seen on network TV, local radio, discussed on various radio shows and things, and discussed with my associates and friends. And I have been able to compile a list. I can't go over the whole list, but just in brief, we've got criminals, children, and psychiatric cases should be. We should take a look at restricting guns with them. Anybody that really buys a weapon of war, this is another point, one of these large AK-47 should be trained on how to safely use it, because these things are demonic. And these gun-free zones should be abolished. That's a point on there. And people that basically want to establish one should be prosecuted for infringing the Second Amendment and facilitating potential mass murder. There should not be any restrictions on citizens to keep and bear arms, open or conceal, because the Second Amendment is clear that that is infringement, and we have the right to have that. A couple of points here about schools and hardening schools. It only makes sense that the doors on classrooms, cafeterias, lavatories at public schools should be bulletproof, and these doors should have peepholes so that you can see through the door to see if there's an assailant trying to get you. The walls between classrooms, lavatories, and hallways should also be bulletproof. So that's a common sense thing there. I suggest every classroom should have a weapon locked into a cabinet, similar to a fire extinguisher or fire axe. And the cabinet combination should be known by certain seniors and all teachers and administrative personnel. Because you have a madman out there shooting, believe me, you're going to want something to counter this. I think very strongly that volunteer teachers, security guards, and administrative people in schools should conceal carry arms and be trained. That they should exist should be promulgated, but exactly who and how many are on any security duty at any given time should be kept secret, so a would-be assailant would never know who they will encounter. I think that we need to reinstate worship in the schools. Right now, the kids are getting their religion from Hollywood movies, so is it really any wonder that the public schools now look like violence-ridden movie sets? Some of the other points that I've amassed here are that these congressmen, as I mentioned earlier, that vote for these any law that infringes the Second Amendment, they should be voted out of office, if not prosecuted. The movie Molon Labe and Midnight Ride, as I mentioned earlier, goes into all of the primer for the Second Amendment and the militia system, and you can get that at moviepubs.net. I highly recommend that your listeners watch these primers. Getting back to some of the reasons, I would say that public schools that have mass shootings should be forced by laws to refund all the property taxes for that year, because citizens should demand and have an expectation that the government they pay for delivers services in safety. And if any of the government's public schools cannot deliver education in a safe and secure environment, then those public schools should be permanently shut down. And I would also recommend that unless these points are put in place, these children should not be expected or forced to attend public school. Public schools, as currently managed by these local, state, and federal governments, are literally chambers of death. And kids who refuse to risk their lives on gun-free campuses of the government public school system should opt out and attend private schools and engage in homeschooling. They should not support the public school system. And the property taxes the largest part of every citizen that owns property's tax is the school tax. I just shelled out a check for $6,000 to pay for my public school, and I never even send my kids there. I homeschooled my kids, and I went to private school, so my parents never were paying for the neighbors' kids and their own kids with the school tax. So if we really want to get some action at the local level, and all the actions at the local level, let's withhold these property taxes and school taxes from the public schools and let the kids refuse to attend until the government assures us that these schools are safe, that they're not chambers of death and mass shooting zones and these gun-free zone insanity. So I think we, the people, have to take some action on our congressmen, on these local people, that these local people that are charging exorbitant amounts of money just because you own real estate, and people that are apartment dwellers are paying the property tax and the school tax also. It's just coming right out of their rent. So, Dan, these are some points that I've amassed by talking to hundreds of people over the last quarter on what we can do, and I don't think there's any one solution. This all leads to the idea of a self-protecting nation. If we had a militia system in this country, none of these points would be necessary. And in fact, once we reinstate the militia and bring the militia system back, these 14 points will probably not even be necessary because the militia will take care of everything. But right now, as you mentioned earlier, the militia has been vilified, and it's our duty to remind people of what the tenets of the Constitution are and the 4 places it talks about the militia.
You know, James, I just love to have your input on these discussions because you always bring in a new wrinkle, and you are one of the more thoughtful people that I know as far as studying subjects and really understand and really comprehend what's behind this stuff. And I love your idea of demanding a refund in zones where school shootings occur. Don't you think that would get, the teachers want to go out on strike because they don't think they're being paid enough, and meanwhile they're teaching our kids cultural Marxism and teaching our kids all these communist ideas rather than teaching them how to read, write, and do arithmetic. And don't you think that if they had their job eliminated when there was a school shooting around, don't you think they would be a lot more likely to get the training necessary and become proficient with firearms because they would be protecting their job? Great idea.
Absolutely. If I had a child in a public school and there was a shooting and they did not have hardened doors, they did not have officers or teachers there with guns, I wouldn't even dream of sending them a check. Dream of it. They would have to send their thugs to my front door and burn my house down before I would send them a school tax check. And I would demand that the school be shut down until it was completely bulletproof and you had guards there. I just can't conceive of how these parents across the country are not demanding these schools do this stuff. They are so brainwashed by the mainstream media, it's absolutely disgusting how these people can wander around and chant the company line of, the mainstream media's gun controls and let's get rid of the guns and gun-free zones. It's absolutely just abhorrent. Mm-hmm. And I think there's no better way to get your public officials to pay attention than to remove their paychecks. In other words, cut the taxes, stop paying taxes, have a tax revolt about this whole thing. If Americans across the country stopped paying the property tax and had a tax revolt on the school tax, you better believe there would be some meetings taking place in D.C. in the local chambers.
Well, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, but in most states, I know this is certainly the case in Montana, if you file a complaint, you can go ahead and pay your taxes, but you can file a complaint that they cannot use those taxes until they address that complaint. And that would be an excellent way to, you're right, let our schools know that if you can't protect our kids by providing a reasonable amount of firearms training for your school teachers or your janitors or whatever, so that if one of these nutcases gets in the school, you've got a way to drop him. I think that's a great idea. I can't imagine anything wrong with that way of thinking, and I think that's, quite frankly, why President Trump is approaching the school shooting thing the way he is, which is arming and training teachers how to defend themselves.
Yeah, it's just absolutely abhorrent that since Columbine we don't have trained teachers and administrative people. We have a situation just heard with this last shooting where the cops are all standing outside of the school hiding or waiting while this guy's running around killing teenagers. So bringing in the standing army police is not the solution. You've got thousands and thousands of ex-military people that are now teachers that are fully familiar with firearms. They could be armed in these schools, trained, and the kids, as I said earlier, you don't have to have everybody carrying a gun, but if there were a few people in those schools, in the faculty that were on rotation duty for security, and they had arms, and any would-be shooter did not know who was armed, I'm telling you, I think that would be a deterrent. Because when you're loading your AK-47, it's a little bit distracting to aiming and loading when you have other people firing back at you.
Right.
And the left talks about, you might hit somebody, friendly fire. Well, that is insane, because you got a guy there with an AK-47 killing everybody. He's going to hit people. The risk is absolutely justified to have people self-defending back. So I just don't understand. I think the left is on these psychiatric drugs, and they've just been watching too many TV shows or something.
Well,
I'm
glad you brought
that up. Talk about that. The mass media and the violence in the movies and video games. I don't think that any normal child. I don't think that affects them, but if you have marginal cases, if you have the country peppered with kids that have been let out of mental institutions or on Thorazine, then these violent games and movies and video games are going to push them over the edge, and this is exactly what we're seeing in the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right, and so many of these young kids. I mean, just a kid with let's say a rambunctious interested personality, they try to put them on Thorazine to calm them down or to make them into dumbed down followers and people that will continue to go along with the status quo, when in fact those young people are, some of them are more creative people if they were just given the right kind of stimulation intellectually. Well, guess what? You put them on Thorazine, and you're right. And then put all these violent video games and all these violent movies and stuff in front of them. Of course we're going to have a lot more of these kind of problems. It's self-perpetuating. And I want you to talk about your movie Mainstream, because it didn't get anywhere nearly as much attention nationally as it should have. And I'll tell you what, it is an incredible documentary film. I think it's absolutely amazing. And of course, I'm a huge supporter of all your films. But let's talk about Mainstream, and let's talk about some of the things that you encountered that are part of this culture to destroy all of our rights, not just our Second Amendment rights.
Well, we produced a movie called Mainstream, how the Hollywood movies and the New York media are promoting the globalist agenda. And it's a 4-part miniseries, and it's available on the internet for free at homevideo.net, or you can get it on DVD, higher quality DVD, at moviepubs.net. I do recommend watching it on DVD because you can't watch it. You have to watch it in 2 sit-down sessions. It's too long, and watching on your computer is going to drive you crazy. But we spent about 2 or 3 years making this movie, It is exhaustive on the movie industry and the New York-based networks. We go into every aspect of how this industry has been taken over by Marxist, liberal personalities that are hell-bent on pushing the globalist agenda, and part of that globalist agenda is to confiscate guns and infringe the Second Amendment. And we explain how this has developed over the last 100, 150 years, from the long march through the institutions, where we had the Frankfurt School basically infiltrating the cultural institutions of the United States. It infected the movie business. So our kids are all being subjected to this Marxist, socialist viewpoint. It's saturating academia. It's saturating the movies. It's saturating the nightly news. It's saturating the clergy even. The film has some incredible people in it. Pastor Baldwin did an incredible job talking about this the cultural Marxism influence, and a lot of this is emanating from the mainstream media. So the movie's there. Of course, the mainstream media did not promote this movie. In fact, we billed the movie as mainstream, not coming to a theater near you.
And I think that was appropriate. Yes, not coming to a theater near you.
Yeah, the movie. If you type it into your Google search engine, is plastered all over the internet. People are picking it up, and it's going viral. It'll be a few years before it just floats everywhere. You can't type the word Hollywood or movies or star into Google or anything without seeing a clip of the movie come up. We broke the movie up into 200 or 300 little pieces of 1 or 2 minutes long each, and plastered them all over like some kind of a splatter bomb. So the movie's out there. The movie's going to permeate everywhere, and the sooner everybody starts to take a look at some of these clips and starts to look at the whole movie, the sooner they're going to get a good idea of what we're dealing with Hollywood and the mainstream media. And we offer concrete solutions on how the media can be handled. There are 6 conglomerates that basically dominate the entire 95 to 98% of everything we see, hear, and read. And these 6 conglomerates have got to be broken up with the Sherman antitrust laws. We have no diversity at the corporate level. We have no diversity at the executive level. We have no diversity at the talent level. We have no diversity at the crew level. We go into the hiring practices of the movie industry and the discrimination. We go into the business practices, the predatory, unethical, and oftentimes illegal practices. The research of entertainment securities attorney John W. Combs, who's the absolute foremost researcher on Hollywood, is in the movie. We're talking about his research on Hollywood and how these people have retained power, how they are indoctrinating our children. And it's a movie that if you think you know how the movie industry operates or what you've been taught in school, I'm sorry to say there's a lot more to it. Mm-hmm. So it's there. Go watch it.
Well, the thing is, I want people to realize how important your films really are, and the best way to go to find out more about all of your films, and you've done them on literally everything from the Federal Reserve System and fiat money, all the way through globalism, through the mainstream media. I mean, your films are absolutely incredible, and I want our listeners to go purchase those films, get those films, and the best way to do that, James, go ahead and give them the best way that they can go and find your films and purchase them.
Well, you can get all the films at moviepubs.net. That's where they're all available on DVD. There's 8 of them. We've produced 8 films since the first one in 2005, Fiat Empire. And you can also watch them on the internet at homevideo.net, because all the films are public services. But we do appreciate people watching them and then grabbing a DVD, because the purchase price of the DVDs, which is modest, help us to produce additional movies. So if you find merit to the movies, you can watch them, share them with your friends, and maybe grab a DVD or two and help us get our next production going. And our current production is Good Guys with Guns. And if you want to find out more about the production, read the script, look at the trailers, you can go to goodguys.us. And that would be good guys having a hyphen between the word good and guys, goodguys.us. And there is the list of who's going to be in the movie and the synopsis and the trailer and the budget and various other items. And then you can donate at that site if you care to help us make this movie and get a producer credit as acknowledgement.
And I have to tell you, James, there's an awful lot to be said for getting one of those producer credits. I've done that on a number of your movies, and there's a sense of pride knowing that you were part of the process that brought those films to the public. And I don't think you've gotten anywhere nearly the notoriety that you should for the movies that you've produced. But one of these days, I've got a feeling you're going to wake up and be famous for the movies that you've made.
Well, it's a testament to how left-leaning the mass media industry is, because you're right, none of these movies get out on the mainstream media. They're all suppressed. We go through this in mainstream, and even though Trump's entire platform is in our movie Original Intent, Dan, which you were one of the producers on, Dan and I put this movie out with our producing partners in around 2007. And if you look at Original Intent, and it's up there at that site I mentioned, homevideo.net, you will see almost every single point that Trump's platform is based on. We talked about NAFTA, we talked about fair trade, we talked about the gutting of the manufacturing base, the 50,000 factories. We have Pat Buchanan in this movie, we have Ron Paul in this movie, all talking about what you're seeing happen right this minute with the Trump platform. So the bottom line is the movies do cause a difference. You put the data out, you educate the public, it goes through the grassroots, and it takes 3 to 5 years before it starts to materialize in the public domain. And so we're hoping that the changes we're advocating for the mass media industry and the changes we're advocating for reviving the militia system, those are being baked into the cake. And the movies, if they continue to be put out and they circulate, we will eventually materialize the exact reality that we want. And that reality is getting back to the United States Constitution, getting back to constitutional principles, applying biblical-based principles that inform the Constitution, and bringing this nation back to a limited republic, exactly as it was envisioned by the founders. And if the American people don't like what is happening, they can always duly amend the Constitution in the light of day. So we have been given an incredible instrument, the most incredible governmental document and structure ever devised by the human race. And we have to get the people that are perverting this educated or out of the way and bring this country back to these principles.
Well, James, I know we're moving into our last break before the hour, and I want to thank you for being our guest. I always enjoy the conversations we have. We've become very good friends over the years, and I can tell you, people, if you get online and you order James's films, and you can have coffee clubs or whatever to show these films to your group, because it's absolutely imperative that this information get out. Again, thank you, James, and we'll look forward to our listeners next week for Connecting the Dots.
Behold a pain